Today I'm going to be doing a reading of Current Affairs. Current Affairs is an online left-wing news outlet. And this particular article was written back in June of 2020, but I think it's still relevant today. And it's titled, "Isn't Right-Wing Populism Just Fascism?" And this article is written by Nathan J. Robinson. Essentially, the entire article is just about him trying to make arguments why quote unquote left wing populism, which really doesn't exist, is more legitimate than right wing populism, which he argues doesn't exist. But I would argue that left wing populism is really a farce because although leftists have popular economic issues, their social issues alienate them from everyone else. And the subtitle reads, "It's a bad idea to listen to right-wingers who claim to be on the side of the people. Usually it turns out they want to crush the people by force." Now, this actually isn't the case. If you actually looked at right-wing populism historically, they usually are on the side of the people, but they usually are against a minority of people who they deem public enemy. Usually, it's some ethnic minority that has a disproportionate amount of power and uses its power in an unfair way, or they have an unfair advantage. So it's essentially the same thing as, well, anyway. Let us ask a question. Who are some famous right-wing populists? Well, let's see. Historically, Hitler and Mussolini can be characterized as right-wing populists. Okay, so historically, Mao and Stalin could be considered popular left-wing populists, right? Exactly. Today, there's Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, a militaristic, sexist homophobe who said if he saw two men kissing in the street, he would beat them. The problem with this is Brazil is largely a socially conservative country. So his value system is consistent with the value system of Brazil. You're critiquing his quote unquote sexist, homophobic behavior. It's simply you trying to impose your neoliberal, leftist American values on a country that never asked for it and never wanted it. There's Marine Le Pen in France who says the progressive Islamization of our country and the increase in political religious demands are calling into question the survival of our civilization. Is she lying? And since when do leftists get around defending Islam? Aren't leftists like pro-women's rights? There's Viktor Orban in Hungary, and in the United States, there's Donald Trump, whose administration has engaged in ceaseless cruelty towards immigrants and who is currently trying to deploy the military against protesters. Okay. All of which is to say right-wing populism seems like a terrible ideology that needs to be rejected. It isn't an ideology. It's a tactic. As a matter of fact, right-wingers tend to shun ideology as a whole. They're usually just religious nationalists. Like Jair Bolsonaro, for example, he's just a religious nationalist. There is no ideology behind him. He isn't a fascist ideology. To the extent that fascism even has an ideology. He isn't a communist. He's just a religious nationalist who's yeah. I disagree with nearly everything these people believe in. And the people of these countries, the populace, disagrees with 90% of what you believe in. The kind of world they believe in is not one I wish to inhabit. And they could say that the populists will say the exact same thing about your beliefs. They are in favor of reactionary cultural traditions, militarized borders, bigotry, and rabid nationalism. They are in favor of reactionary cultural traditions. Those are their cultural traditions. You don't have a right to impose your traditions on everyone else. Militarized borders. It's their country. Bigotry and rabid nationalism. Define bigotry and rabid nationalism. It is nearly impossible to support a country without nationalism. Even Stalin eventually, the Soviet Union eventually adopted nationalism as its national credo. Even China, the only reason China even is so successful is because it's so nationalistic. They have a unified country. They're not imperialistic. They're not globalistic. They're nationalistic. They care about their own people. I am a leftist, meaning that I favor free movement of people and multiculturalism. Then your leftism is incompatible with socialism. Because free movement of people and multiculturalism, free movement of people is bad for the economy. It's bad for working class. Multiculturalism is bad for the working class, but it's atomizing. It destroys the sense of belonging ordinary people have. I am anti-nationalist and anti-militarist. Donald Trump's ideology seems to be monstrous. Donald Trump doesn't have an ideology. I find it peculiar then that to hear right populism and left populism discussed as part of the same tendency. Usually when this is done, it is by centrists who subscribe to the horseshoe theory that fascism and socialism have a lot in common. The idea is that the political spectrum instead of a line is a horseshoe shape, meaning that the end comes together. This is what led to the Center for American Progress and American Enterprise Institute, a quote-unquote progressive and quote free market think tank, respectively, to collaborate on a project about combating authoritarian populism. The American Enterprise Institute is just, from both the right and the left, it's just libertarian. They are combating quote-unquote authoritarian populism because quote-unquote authoritarian populism threatens libertarian economics. Because the state, authoritarians and populists will use the state to crack down on private businesses to the benefit of the masses of people. The idea is that Donald Trump, Hugo Chavez, Bernie Sanders, Jair Bolsonaro, etc., can all be understood as part of the same tendency because they all seek to overthrow quote-unquote elites and quote-unquote the establishment in the name of the people and use the power of the state to create justice. That's true. But this idea is fundamentally wrong because it fails to acknowledge the massive difference between the left and the right. Namely that the right's brand of populism is a complete and utter swindle that involves scapegoating foreigners for social problems, while left populism is generally anti-racist and egalitarian. Foreigners are responsible for many of the social problems we face, and anti-racism is just a tool for neoliberal economic policy. There are very few genuine racists. What you call racism is just people not wanting to feel alienated in their own countries, which isn't racism. It's just natural. Right-wing populists do not actually care about quote-unquote the people. Trump and Bolsonaro may have pitched themselves as crusaders against the elites, but neither actually cares about helping anyone but their wealthy cronies. Both want to prioritize public assets. I pretty much agree with this because, Trump hasn't done a good job, Bolsonaro either, mostly because the countries their presence of are so corrupt, it's extremely difficult to work through that bureaucracy and the oligarchs. And then he says, we have the climate, the climate. They are as populist as the Nazis were socialists, meaning that it is a convenient label that makes them sound like something they aren't. Well, you can see why I would be frustrated then by anything coming from the left that treats right-wing populism as something good and legitimate. This is why I am disturbed by the Populist Guide to 2020, A New Right and a New Left Are Rising, which seems to embrace exactly the horseshoe theory that I see as so wrong and dangerous. The Populist Guide to 2020 is co-authored by Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, who host the morning show Rising on the Hill. I have been on Rising several times, and I found it to be a refreshingly original show. It has the look and tone of cable news, but is more substantive and features guests and stories that are excluded from mainstream networks. Wonderful leftists that you won't see anywhere else are invited on Rising. Many of them are friends of mine. I am especially impressed by the talent of Crystal Ball, who has emerged as one of the sharpest and most valuable commenters on the contemporary left. She is smart, stylish, and fun and fearless, and I like the work she does. But there's something so wrong about the framework that a quote new right and quote a new left should be discussed as part of the same tendency. I think the only way you can present this is to ignore the core features that actually define the new right. The Populist Guide 2020 suggests that while Ball and Jetty have some differences, fundamentally they're on the same page. The framework of being pro-working class recurs throughout the book, but while promising to provide an outline of a new right and a new left, the book actually mostly avoids discussing what the new right actually stands for. Instead, though Ball and Jetty each write separate chapters, they mostly stick to what they agree on, emphasizing criticism of the failings of neoliberal Democrats and free market Republicans. I concur with most what Ball and Jetty write, and just when I watch Rising, I find myself on board with 90% of what Ball says, about 80% of what Jetty says. That's because in the book, Jetty makes criticisms of Democratic politicians that those of us on the socialist left also share. And Jetty rails against the influence of billionaires in American life and the outsized power of large corporations. He sounds like a lot like Bernie Sanders much of the time. In fact, for a long time, I assumed Jetty was a leftist because I had only seen small bits of his work. I was quite taken aback when I went on the show and found him sympathetically agreeing with my economic socialism before suddenly defending some of the worst features of American military policy. In fact, Jetty even favorably cites current affairs articles all about Pete in an essay entitled A McKenzie Presidency Would Be a Hellish Future, the thesis of which I completely agree with. And so, it's possible to get through the Populist Guide 2020 and come away convinced that the central thesis, namely that the populist right and the populist left have a lot in common and should band together to fight the common enemy, the dastardly neoliberals. But Jetty hits some strange and disquieting notes, at one point commenting that the Wall Street, Hollywood, and NBA, and nearly every other part of the commanding heights of American culture has been infested with Chinese cash. And when you watch the show, you start to pick up on some other disturbing beliefs. He is in favor of strict immigration control. If you want to expand the social safety net, you must inherently reduce the size of the population that's going to apply. Quoted from Jetty, which is not actually true. During the current uprising, he has echoed Tom Cotton, even asking, was it un-American for LBJ to use the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions to stop race riots in Detroit? And Jetty also criticized protesters as somehow being embedded with corporations. They are. If you watch and read enough of his work, you'll finally remember what Jay's projects are. He's pro-Trump, as evidenced by the fact that he proudly displays a picture of himself with the president on his Twitter profile. And then we need to ask ourselves once again, what is the right-wing populism exactly, with which we on the left are supposedly comfortable to ally ourselves with? And if we get past our common criticism of a democratic establishment, which Trump makes too, and which he is often correct about, we remember that the right-wing populism is the politics of Trump and Bolsonaro. It is sexist, and xenophobic. These words don't mean anything. They're just slurs. They're so amorphous. Racist, sexist, and xenophobic can mean anything. It's a giant pride and jelly speaks of politics that is pro-worker yet socially conservative, i.e., economically left but bigoted. Define bigoted. What you consider bigoted is what others consider normal. It may sound a little socialist at times, but it is not the socialism of Karl Marx, who thought the workers of the world should unite. It is instead strictly nationalist, a kind of national socialism, if you will. So basically, socialism one country, or what China does, socialism with Chinese characteristics. Why do you need to export socialism around the world to countries that never asked for it and never wanted it? Shouldn't you be why do you have these Trotskyist beliefs? Populism has a somewhat honorable tradition. See Thomas Frank's new book on the subject. And the U.S. populists have historically championed economic rights in many admirable ways. As this magazine has shown, figures like Huey Long are often treated as villains despite offering an agenda that is in many ways more radically fair than anything offered by the two major political parties today. But populists, including Long, have always had a terrible blind spot when it comes to racial justice, and is far better to an outright socialist. Define racial justice. Do you mean that that everyone should be treated equally regardless of their skin color? Or do you mean that we should have critical race theory in elementary schools? And pretend like the illegitimacy rate among blacks isn't a major problem that's holding them back. Socialists like Martin Luther King and the Black Panther Party have believed in radical economic equality, but have also made it clear that specific racial harms cannot be considered secondary issues. Their approach is quote-unquote intersectional, and that it is capable of seeing how there are multiple different vectors of injustice that operate in complex ways rather than just a simple struggle between the nation and the elites. In the right-wing framework, the elites often end up being cosmopolitan immigrants or Jews. Whatever. The intersectional approach is a much more thoughtful, useful, and nuanced approach to thinking about social struggle. And that's why Fred Hampton is a far better role model today than William Jennings Bryan. Let's be clear about the implication of accepting the theory of politics presented in the Populist Guide 2020. If we assume, as the book says, that the correct alliance is between the new right and the new left, then Bernie Sanders supporters have more in common with Donald Trump than with Joe Biden. In fact, I think one could take away from this book that it would make sense for the left to vote for Trump than Biden. But this is madness. Trump represents everything we're trying to destroy. I've written before about the dangers of accepting nationalism wrapped in socialist rhetoric. In the context of reviewing Tucker Carlson's book, Carlson, like Jetty, rants against the billionaire class, but is also a racist, okay, whatever, whom the Daily Stormer has called, quote, their greatest ally. The Daily Stormer is satire. Of course, Carlson has no interest in actually trying to comprehend the arguments being made by police and prison abolitionists, which are about reducing terror. They don't want a country where people are free to be as violent as they like. They want a country where violence is actually prevented effectively through non-violent means rather than just dealt with after the fact through the counterproductive method of caging millions of people. Carlson has a long tried. Carlson has long tried to whip up the fears of aggrieved white people, and he makes clear he's talking to white people, pointing out the fact that the country was European, Christian, English speaking 50 years ago and has become a place with no ethnic majority, and now your neighbors are different. Everything he says is true, though. This is politics of fear and bigotry that targets the weak and will never actually redistribute any power. The age-old labor question is, which side are you on? Carlson and Jetty, Trump, Bolsonaro, they answer that question emphatically and openly. They are not on our side. They will use the might of the state against us. Right-wing populism is simply a lie, and nobody who's on the left should have anything to do with it. Right-wing populism is really the only kind of populism that really works. Left-wing populism, as you can see in this article, usually just consists of left-wing ideologues who are completely detached from flesh and blood people, imposing their view of reality, their perspective on the whole of society. At least with right-wing populists with quote-unquote bigoted views, the views shared by the vast majority of society is imposed on the society. When it comes to leftists, they are elitist. They're completely detached from what ordinary people believe in. Which is why you see all these culture wars, all these culture war issues that are decided in court or through legislation. They're not voted on or debated. Because if you actually voted on them or debated them, you would see the vast majority of people do not agree with them. For example, gay marriage. What does gay marriage have to do with socialism? It's just a wedge. It's just a wedge issue. It's just this way for this displaced left-wing wannabe elites. Just wait for them to impose their values on the people they see as inferior to them. But anyway, this is why I don't really see the left-wing, like leftist socialists, going anywhere, because they're too wedded to the value system of the 1960s. This revolutionary, this social revolutionary mindset, this idea that we have to change the values of the whole society for no apparent reason, just fits an ideal that is completely contrary to human nature.